Two pots on the same bench, same plant, same price, same little plastic tag, and when you pick them up, one of them is noticeably heavier than the other. Almost every one of us reaches for the heavy one. It feels like more plant for the money. It feels like somebody back there has been paying attention, keeping it watered, taking care of it. The light one feels dry and a little neglected and a little sad, and we leave it behind. I want to tell you something before you spend another dollar at a garden center, and it is going to sound backwards the first time you hear it. That heavy pot is very often the one that dies in your yard. And the reason has almost nothing to do with how well it was watered. Think about what a root system actually is. It is a set of straws. Every fine white root down in that mix is pulling water up out of the container, moving it through the stem, and letting it out through the leaves. A plant with a working root system empties its own pot. That is not a side effect, that is the job. So when one pot is still heavy and wet on a warm afternoon, and the pot beside it has gone light, you are usually not looking at one plant that got watered and one that got missed. A lot of the time you are looking at one plant that is still drinking and one plant that has stopped. That is the whole video in one sentence, and we are 2 minutes in. But I want to go further than that, because once you understand why the heavy pot lies to you, you start to see that almost everything we have been taught to look for at a nursery is the wrong thing. Here is the shift I want you to make, and if you take nothing else away, take this one. You are not buying a plant. You are buying a pot of somebody else's soil, with a plant sitting in it. That sounds like word games. It is not. It changes what you look at. Because the plant on top is a receipt. It tells you what happened over the last 3 or 4 weeks, when the grower was getting it ready to sell. The pot underneath is the record. It tells you what happened over the last 8 months, and it tells you what is about to move into your garden and live there permanently. Everything on that bench has a history. It grew in a specific mix. It got a specific amount of water on a specific schedule. It sat under a specific quality of light. It was fed a certain way. In many cases, it was given something to keep it a certain shape. And there is a whole community of living things down in that container that came along for the ride. None of that is printed on the tag. All of it is readable in about 60 seconds if you know where to put your eyes and your hands. And it costs nothing. So we are going to walk 7 red flags. But I want to be honest with you up front about something, because it is going to cut against the title on the screen. Most of the things gardeners have been trained to reject at a nursery are cheap, fixable problems. The things that actually kill the plant are almost invisible from the top. By the end of this, we are going to have flipped the whole list around, and I am going to make an argument that I expect some of you are going to fight me on in the comments. Good. I want you to. Let us go back to that heavy pot, because there is a name for what is usually going on inside it. When roots die and rot, they stop absorbing. That is obvious enough. But here is the part that trips people up. The water does not go anywhere. It just sits. The mix stays saturated day after day, and to a shopper walking past it, saturated looks exactly like well cared for. The plant pathologists who work with commercial nurseries have been saying this for years, and it is worth hearing plainly. Most of what gets blamed on overwatering in a container nursery is not overwatering at all. It is root rot, usually a water mold in the genus Phytophthora. Wet soil did not cause the disease. The disease caused the wet soil. And this is the thing that makes it dangerous for you and me. The top of the plant can look completely fine. Green leaves, decent color, a few flowers. The rod is down in the dark, working on the root cortex and moving up toward the crown, and the leaves have not gotten the message yet. You bring it home, you plant it on a Saturday, and about 10 days later, it wilts on a sunny afternoon and never comes back. And you blame yourself. You think you planted it wrong. You did not plant it wrong. It was already gone when you paid for it. So here is how you check, and all of it is free. First, lift. Pick up your plant and pick up the one next to it. Same size pot, same species. If yours is dramatically heavier on a warm day, put it down and look closer. Second, smell the surface. Healthy container mix smells like bark and damp forest floor. Mix over dead roots goes sour. It is a sharp, boggy, slightly sulfur smell, and once you have smelled it once, you never forget it. Third, and this is the one almost nobody does, Take your thumbnail and scrape a tiny window in the bark of the main stem, right down at the level of the mix. On a healthy plant, that thin layer under the bark is bright and green or creamy white. Extension pathologists point to a reddish-brown discoloration in that tissue, right at the transition zone where stem meets soil, as a warning sign of root and crown rot. It takes 3 seconds, and it costs the plant nothing. Fourth, slide it out of the pot. You are allowed. If a nursery will not let you look at the root system of a plant you are about to buy, that is information too. What you want to see is white or pale tan roots that feel firm when you roll them between your fingers. What you do not want is roots that look water-soaked and brown, that feel soft, and where the outer sleeve of the root slips off in your fingers and leaves a thin thread behind. That sloughing outer layer is the tell. One more thing worth knowing. Diseased plants tend to have fewer roots overall, and they tend to fail to push new roots when they get moved into a bigger container. So a small, thin, sparse root system on a plant that has clearly been in that pot a long while is its own quiet warning. This next one is not about the plant at all. It is about what is living in the pot with it, and of everything in this video, this is the one I would most like you to remember. Look at the surface of the potting mix. Not at the leaves, the surface. If the top inch has gone loose and grainy and looks like somebody emptied a coffee filter over it, put the plant down and walk away. I mean it. It does not matter how good the top looks or how much it has been marked down. That texture is the signature of jumping worms. These are earthworms in the genus Amynthus, introduced from Eastern Asia, and they are not the earthworms you grew up being told were good for the garden. Extension services across the country have been raising the alarm on these for a decade now, and here is why they matter to somebody standing in a garden center aisle. Ordinary earthworms burrow deep. They pull organic matter down, they open channels, they mix mineral soil with residue. That is the aeration and drainage benefit everybody talks about. Jumping worms do not do that. They live in the leaf litter and the top few inches, and they do not build burrows at all. So they give you none of the deep aeration, none of the nutrient movement, none of the water infiltration that people assume earthworms provide. What they do instead is eat. They work through surface organic matter at a tremendous rate, and they leave behind that loose granular casting, and the result is that the crumb structure of your soil comes apart. Soil scientists studying them have said flatly that jumping worms alter soil structure more than any other worm. Water runs through it fast, moisture-holding drops, and the litter layer that was feeding your whole soil food web simply disappears. Now here is the part that should make you careful in a nursery specifically. These worms will readily crawl up into nursery pots to reproduce. The cocoons are about the size of a mustard seed. They are very hard to see, and they survive the winter. And the worms can reproduce without mating, which means one animal, or one cocoon in one pot, is enough to start a population in your yard. There is no chemical control. Nothing is registered for them. And I want to be clear about that, because I have seen people reach for something under the sink. Do not. Using a pesticide product that is not labeled for this is against the law. It will kill your beneficial soil life, and it will not solve the problem. Read the label on anything you use, always. So prevention is the whole game, and prevention happens at the checkout counter. Look at the surface of the mix. If you see the granules, do not buy it. If you have already brought a plant home and you are unsure, the guidance from Extension is to knock as much mix off the root ball as you can into a trash bin, not onto your beds, and rinse the roots clean before planting. Bare root plants and plants in clean, sterile mix are the safest thing you can bring in. And if you go to a church plant sale or a garden club swap this spring, and somebody hands you a division out of their own yard in a scoop of their own soil, that is exactly the route these things travel. It is not a reason to stop trading plants with neighbors. It is a reason to wash the roots first. Whether jumping worms have reached your county is a real question with a real answer, and your local extension office will know. That is a phone call worth making before planting season. Now we get to the one that I think is the biggest blind spot in home gardening, because it explains a mystery that a lot of you have lived through without ever getting an answer for. You buy a plant in May. It is compact, it is dense, it is absolutely loaded with bloom, and the foliage is that deep saturated green that looks almost artificial. You get it home and it is beautiful for a month. And then the next season, it comes back as something else, twice as tall, Loose and open and sprawling. Fewer flowers, held on long floppy stems. And you think you did something wrong, or the nursery mislabeled it. Nobody mislabeled anything. You were looking at a plant that had been chemically held in shape, and the chemistry wore off. Commercial growers use a family of compounds called plant growth regulators. The common ones in ornamental production are damonazide, paclobutrazol, uniconazole, and fluorprimidol, and the mechanism is elegant and simple. A plant lengthens its stem between leaves using a hormone family called gibberellins. These compounds block the plant from making gibberellin, so the leaves still form, the flower buds still form, but the stem between them never stretches. You get all the plant, packed into a fraction of the height. Two details from the production literature matter for us. The first is that the triazole compounds in that group are the most persistent of all the growth retardants. This is not a substance that is gone by the weekend. The second is that they move in the xylem, which is the upward pipe, so they stay where they were put and do not redistribute. That is why you sometimes get a plant with a strange two-story look, crowded and stunted down at the base where the chemical worked, and normal spacing up top on growth that came after. Growers also report side effects that are worth knowing about as a buyer. Flowering can be delayed. Flowers can come in smaller than they should be, and stems can come up so short that the blooms no longer sit clearly above the foliage the way that plant is supposed to hold them. So how do you read it on the bench? For free. Look at the spacing between leaves along the stem. On a plant grown without much intervention, there is a rhythm to it, a fairly even ladder. On a heavily regulated plant, the bottom several inches are jammed, leaf on leaf on leaf, almost no stem showing, and then somewhere up the plant, the spacing suddenly relaxes. That transition point is roughly when the chemical stopped controlling things. Then look at proportion. Ask yourself whether the flower looks too big for the stalk holding it. A bloom that seems oversized for the plant underneath it is a plant that was shortened, not a plant that is naturally that stout. Now I want to be fair here, because this is not a scandal, and I am not going to sell it to you as one. There is a genuine reason growers do this. A compact plant survives being stacked on a truck. It survives 3 weeks on a retail shelf getting knocked around. It ships more per pallet, and it arrives intact. If growers shipped plants at their natural loose habit, a lot of them would arrive as a broken mess, and every one of us would complain. Nobody is hiding this from you. It is printed in every extension floriculture bulletin in the country. It is just that nobody at the register has any reason to bring it up. What you do with it is this. Do not judge mature size or habit by what is in the pot. Go find the botanical name and look up what that plant actually does at maturity, and give it that much room. And when it comes back looking looser and taller in year 2, do not assume you failed. That is the plant. You are finally meeting it. Here is one that costs people whole plants every single spring, and it is entirely avoidable. A leaf is not a fixed object. A leaf is built to order for the light it expects. Under bright light, a plant builds what botanists call a sunleaf, thicker, with a deeper layer of tall column-shaped cells called palisade cells stacked under the surface, which is where most of the photosynthetic machinery lives. Under dim light, it builds a shade leaf, thinner, with far less of that palisade layer, spread wide to catch what little light there is. Now think about where nursery stock is grown. Under shade cloth, in a polyhouse, in the covered section at the back of the lot. Those plants are wearing shade leaves. Then you take that plant home on a bright Saturday in June and set it in a spot with 6 or 8 hours of direct sun, and you have just handed a leaf far more light energy than its internal machinery can process. The excess energy has nowhere useful to go, and it starts damaging the photosynthetic apparatus itself. The term for it is photoinhibition. On the ground, it looks like bleached patches, crisped edges, whole leaves going pale and papery within a few days. And here is where it gets genuinely interesting, and where the research answers a question you have probably wondered about. There is a study on sycamore maple seedlings where researchers grew plants at 8 different light levels, from full shade all the way to full sun, and then moved them out into direct sunlight. What they found is that the already formed leaves could partly rebuild themselves. Within 30 days, those pre-shaded leaves got thicker, mostly by elongating the palisade cells. The leaf retooled itself in place, which is remarkable when you consider it was a mature leaf. But not all of them. The seedlings that had been grown in the deepest shade suffered photooxidative damage that did not reverse. That is your answer. That is why one plant scorches in July and is fine by August, and the one next to it scorches and never recovers. It is not luck, and it is not your watering can. It is how far that leaf had to travel, and whether it started from too far back. So what do you do, and what does it cost? Nothing. It costs you patience. Ask, or look, at where the plant was being held on the lot. If it came from under cover or out of the shade house, do not plant it into full sun the day you get home. Set it in a spot with morning sun and afternoon shade for about a week to 2 weeks and move it out into more light in steps. Old-timers called this hardening off and mostly used it for vegetable seedlings, but the physiology is identical for a 2-gallon shrub. I know that sounds like a small, dull thing next to everything else in this video. It is the cheapest insurance in gardening and almost nobody does it, and I think that is precisely because there is no product attached to it. You have seen this. A neat layer of dark, fresh potting mix sitting on the surface of the container, sometimes with a little bark top dressing over it, and the whole pot looks clean and tended. The folk wisdom says that fresh layer is hiding fungus or weeds. Sometimes that is true, but the more useful reading is simpler and it costs you money more often. A fresh layer usually means the plant was recently potted up into a larger container, which means 2 things. First, a real portion of what you are paying for is mix, not roots. That pot is not full of plant yet. Second, and more practically, when you go to plant it, the root ball is going to fall apart in your hands because the roots have not knit through that new material. That is not automatically a reason to refuse. It is a reason to pay a smaller pot price for it in your head and to handle it gently going into the ground. But here is the part that actually matters, and it is the reason I keep this on the list. That fresh layer hides the root flare. Every woody plant has a point where the trunk stops being trunk and starts spreading out into the top roots. That flare is supposed to sit at the soil surface. When a grower tops off a container, the flare can end up buried an inch or 2 or 3 below the surface of the mix, and then you bring it home and do the responsible thing. You plant it at the same depth it was in the pot, and you have just buried the flare permanently, in your yard, forever. So do this. Before you buy, push a finger down into the mix right against the stem and feel for where the trunk widens out. If you have to go down more than about an inch to find it, that is a plant you will need to set higher than the mix line when you plant it, and that is worth knowing at the register rather than discovering 3 years later. And while your finger is down there, that same fresh layer is exactly what hides the coffee ground texture we talked about earlier. 2 problems, 1 motion. This one sounds like the boring administrative item on the list. It is not. It is the one that determines whether you can get help later. Pick up the tag and look for 3 things. A botanical name, in Latin, genus and species, a hardiness zone range, and a mature size, given as a real number, not a mood. If the tag gives you a trademarked marketing name and nothing else, you have a problem that is bigger than it looks. You cannot look that plant up. You cannot find out what it actually does in year 5. You cannot check whether it is hardy where you live. And critically, you cannot call your county extension office and ask about it, because they work in botanical names, and they cannot help you diagnose a plant that only exists under a brand. Watch out for a light requirement written as full sun to part shade with nothing else. In some cases, that is honest, because some plants really do have that range. In a lot of cases, it means nobody tested it in your climate, and the tag was written to be true everywhere, and therefore useful nowhere. A plant that takes full sun in Maine may need afternoon shade in Georgia. The tag is printed once for the whole country. So before you pay, take a photograph of the tag. Look up the botanical name on your phone right there in the aisle. And then do the thing I am going to keep saying in every one of these videos, because it is the single highest value free service in American gardening. Check with your local extension office and know your USDA hardiness zone, not the zone on the tag, yours. Zone maps have been revised, and a lot of people are gardening on a number they memorized decades ago. I want to handle this last one carefully, because it is real, it matters, and it also gets wildly overstated online. A lot of us over the last 10 years have started buying with pollinators in mind. We look for the little bee on the tag. That instinct is a good one, and I do not want to talk anybody out of it. In 2017, a research team led by Andrea Lentola, working with the bumblebee ecologist Dave Goulson at the University of Sussex, published a study in the journal Environmental Pollution. They took 29 different ornamental plants sold to the public under bee-friendly labeling, and they screened the leaves, the pollen, and the nectar for a panel of insecticides and fungicides. Only 2 of the 29 came back clean. 23 of them carried more than 1 pesticide. One plant carried 7 different agricultural chemicals, and another carried 10. Neonicotinoid insecticides showed up in more than 70% of the plants tested. And in the pollen, some of those residues were at concentrations that overlap with levels already known to cause harm to bees. The reason neonicotinoids specifically matter here is mechanical. They are systemic. The plant takes them up and moves them through its vascular system, which means they end up in the tissues and in the pollen and nectar. So a plant treated in production is not clean simply because you did not spray anything. Now here is the honest half, and I would rather you hear it from me than find out later and feel misled. That was a British study on British retail. The authors themselves were careful to say that the net effect on pollinators is not clear, because these plants are also a genuine food source. One reviewer made a point that I think is fair. Unless you buy a large number of contaminated plants and put them all in together, the residues a bee encounters are going to be diluted across everything else it is foraging on in your neighborhood. And in the United States, public pressure has already pushed several large retail chains to make commitments about reducing this in their supply. So I am not telling you to panic, and I am not telling you to stop buying plants. I am telling you what the researchers themselves recommended, which is the cheapest advice in this entire video. Grow the pollinator plants from seed. Zinnias, cosmos, sunflowers, borage, bee balm, milkweed. A packet costs less than 1 perennial, and a pollinator patch grown from seed carries nothing but what you put on it. Trade divisions with gardening friends, washing the roots as we discussed. And when you do buy from a small local grower who can actually answer the question, because most of them can, and most of them are glad to be asked. One thing I am not going to do is make any claim about what any of this means for people. That is not my lane. There is no good evidence for the things you see said about it online, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. This is about bees. All right, now I am going to turn around and take apart the list that most videos on this topic give you, including a few things you might have expected me to say. Because here is my honest position after years of doing this. Most gardeners at a nursery reject the wrong plants. We buy with our eyes, so we reject ugly and we accept pretty. And the ugly problems are almost always the cheap ones. Root-bound, a plant that has filled its pot and started circling, is the single most common thing people are told to refuse. I will take it. A tight root ball is a plant with a functioning root system that ran out of room, which is a completely different situation from a plant with a failing root system. It is a 60-second fix with a clean knife or your fingers before it goes in the ground, and root-bound plants are frequently the ones that got marked down. If the crown is firm and the roots are white, a root-bound plant is often the best value on the entire lot. I will take the root-bound one over the pretty one every single time, and I suspect some of you are going to disagree with me about that. A few aphids. Genuinely not a crisis. Aphids are soft-bodied, they are eaten by nearly everything, and a healthy yard has a standing army of ladybird beetle larvae, lacewings, hoverfly larvae, and parasitic wasps waiting for exactly this delivery. Rinse the plant with water at the hose and get on with your life. Spotted or ragged older leaves. Look at where the damage is. If the oldest, lowest leaves look rough and everything new coming out of the tip is clean, that plant is fine. It is abandoning old tissue, which is normal. If the damage is on the newest growth at the growing point, that is a different conversation, and I would put it back. Leggy and stretched. That is a plant that was grown a little too close to its neighbors and reached for light. It is a pruning job, not a disease. And I would rather have a stretched plant showing me its true habit than a squat one whose habit I cannot see at all. No flowers. In my opinion, this is the most expensive mistake in the aisle. Given two identical plants and one is in full bloom and one is only in bud, buy the one in bud, every time. Flowering is expensive work. A plant in full bloom on the bench is spending its stored energy on a display for you instead of on the root system it is going to need to survive its first summer in your ground. Sitting a long time on the clearance rack, time by itself is not the killer. What time does is the killer. And those are two different things. A plant that has been sitting has usually run out of root room and has usually accumulated fertilizer salts in the mix, and both of those are fixable. What is not fixable is a soft crown. So do not judge by how long it sat. Judge by what you find when you check. So why is none of this common knowledge? Why did you have to find it on the internet from a stranger instead of learning it the first time you walked into a garden center? I want to be careful here because there is a version of this conversation that turns into a conspiracy, and I do not think that is what is happening. Look at what we just covered. Lift the pot and feel the weight. Look at the surface of the mix. Scrape the bark with a thumbnail. Push a finger down to find the flare. Read the spacing between the leaves. Give the plant 2 weeks of partial shade before full sun. Every single one of those is free. Not one of them can be packaged. Not one of them can be patented, branded, put on a shelf at end cap, or sold to you in a bottle with a picture of a tomato on it. There is no margin in any of it. That is not a villain. That is just how attention gets allocated. Techniques that make somebody money get advertised, filmed, demonstrated, and taught. Techniques that cost nothing become economically invisible. They do not get taught, not because anyone is suppressing them, but because nobody has any particular reason to stand up and say them. And a nursery is optimizing for the moment of sale, because the moment of sale is the only moment they are paid for. Nobody is coming out to your yard in September to see how it did. If shoppers reward compact and floriferous, growers will produce compact and floriferous. We are part of that loop. Every one of us who reached for the heavy pot taught the system what we wanted. Here is the whole thing as a routine. It takes about a minute, and you can do it holding a coffee. 1. Lift it. Compare its weight to the pot beside it. Heavy and soggy on a warm day means look closer, not buy. 2. Look at the surface of the mix before you look at a single leaf. Loose granular coffee ground texture means walk away, no matter what the plant looks like or what it costs. 3. Smell it. Bark and forest floor is good. Sour and boggy is not. 4. Push a finger down at the stem and find the root flare. More than about an inch down means plan to plant it high. 5. Scrape a small window in the bark at the soil line with your thumbnail. Green or cream underneath, good. Reddish brown, put it down. 6. Slide it out of the pot and look. White and firm is what you want. Brown, soft, water-soaked, with the outer layer sliding off, is what you refuse. Circling roots are fine. 7. Read the leaf spacing. Crammed at the base and relaxed higher up tells you the shape in front of you is temporary. 8. Read the tag for a botanical name and a hardiness range and photograph it. That is it. And notice what is not on that list. Nothing about how many flowers it has. Let us make this simple, because the clearance rack is where the real money is in gardening, and most people are afraid of it. Buy it if the crown is firm and the roots are white, and the surface of the mix is clean, no matter how bad the top looks. Foliage is the cheapest thing to replace. A plant can lose every leaf it has and rebuild the whole canopy in a season, if the root system and the crown are sound. Half-dead-looking clearance shrubs with good roots have been some of the best plants I have ever put in the ground. Walk away if the crown is soft, or the mix smells sour, or the surface is granular, no matter how good the top looks. Green leaves on a rotted crown are the most expensive thing in the store, because they cost you the price of the plant, plus the hole, plus your Saturday, plus a season of waiting to find out. And if you are genuinely on the fence, remember you can buy it, hold it in its pot in a sheltered spot for 2 weeks, and watch it before you commit it to a permanent place in your beds. That waiting period is an old nursery habit that home gardeners quietly dropped, and it is worth bringing back. I want to end somewhere a little wider than a shopping list. For most of the history of gardening, people did not buy plants. They grew them or they were given them. A cutting came over a fence. A division came from a funeral or a wedding or a neighbor moving away. What moved between gardens was a living thing and a small amount of somebody's soil, and everybody understood, without needing the vocabulary, that both parts were arriving. We still do that. We just do it through a supply chain now, at scale, from 1,000 miles away. And in the middle of all that convenience, we lost the habit of looking at the soil part. That is really the whole message of this channel, and it is why I keep saying feed the soil, not the plant. The plant is the part that is easy to see, so it gets all of our attention and all of our money. The soil is the part that decides. And in a plastic pot on a metal bench in April, the soil is the part telling you the truth, while the flowers are telling you a story. So the next time you are standing in that aisle, take the extra minute. Set down the heavy one. Pick up the light one, the one nobody wanted, and look at its roots. 90% of the time you are going to find something white and firm and full of promise, marked half off, that nobody else in the store bothered to look at. Now I want to hear from you, and I want a real argument, not just agreement. I said I will take the root-bound plant over the pretty one every time. Tell me I am wrong. If you have had a root-bound plant fail on you, I want to hear what happened, because I might be overconfident about that. And tell me about the rescue. Every one of you has one. The half-dead thing off the clearance rack, marked down to a couple of dollars, that has now outlived every single full-price plant you ever brought home. What was it? What did it look like when you bought it? And how long has it been in the ground? That is my favorite kind of comment on this channel, and I read all of them. One more. If your family had a rule about buying plants, something your mother or your grandfather said in the aisle, put it down below. Some of those old rules are better than anything in the research, and some of them are folklore, and half the fun is arguing about which is which.